Two apologies. One is Omar asked me to talk about development and conflict, so I'm going to sound like Dr. Doom, which I don't want to. I mean, I think there's lots of positive, hopeful things about the development process, which unfortunately I will ignore in this talk. And the second is apologies to some of you who may have been attending some of the conflict sessions, and you may know a little bit about this work, so it could be a bit boring. Okay, so with those apologies firmly in place, let me say what my starting point is as a development. When I put my development hat on and I think about conflict, my starting point really is that I want to think of economic development as a fundamentally uneven process. Now that seems almost like a truism, except for the fact that the vast majority, the main framework of macroeconomic approach to development relies on the notion of balanced growth, convergence, steady states, and so forth. I don't think any of those animals really exist. Of course, nor do the people who work in this area think the same way. I mean, they also know these animals don't exist. But I think that they're fundamentally, it's not even a first order approximation. I think I think it's really time to jettison models of convergence and start with notions and viewpoints about development which think of it as an uneven process. That said, of course, there is a literature, a sizable literature of people working in the area of uneven growth. And I don't want to go into too much detail here because this is not the main focus of my talk, but just to give you some ideas, there's a whole set of theories which are based on path dependence or sensitivity to initial conditions. So there's a large literature based on non-convexities or historical accidents sealing into subsequent paths of development. There is a literature on structural change. So, one sector grows, another sector shrinks in the course of development, if for no other reason than for the fact that demand patterns are not homothetic. Okay, so fundamentally, demand patterns are non-homothetic, and that by itself is going to create major compositional changes, amplified by the input-output matrix as you go through the development process. And finally, many countries are globalizing. Many developing countries are globalizing. We just saw an example from China. And as a result of globalization, one thing that comes about is certain sectors which have comparative advantages in trade tend to rapidly grow, or there is foreign direct investment like outsourcing and services and so forth in particular sectors. They tend to grow. And this again tends to unbalance the economy, right? Now, when we think of these sectoral imbalances that are possibly going to average out in the overall course of development. First, this sector will grow and that one will grow, and maybe in the long run everything is ergodic, right? But in the short to medium run, things are always unbalancing in one way or the other. And the fundamental thing I think to recognize in this is that in all of this, the lives of others, especially the successes of others, are on display. Okay, and the notion that for people who are getting left behind, their aspirations and frustrations are all socially generated by what they see around them. Okay, so that's how I want to make my first link from development to conflict. Okay, and it's unclear whether this. That's why I use the two words aspirations and frustration, because it's unclear whether this exposure leads to betterment or to despair. Right? And a very good example of that comes from Albert Hirschman's tunnel effect. I don't know how many of you know about Hirschman's tunnel, but it's a lovely paradigm. So imagine, actually the tunnel has very little to do with it, but imagine that you're caught inside a tunnel in a multi-lane highway and all the lanes are jammed, right? You're in one of them. And then you see a lane beside you of cars starts to move. What is going to be your first reaction? So Hirschman argues, from an informational theoretic point of view really, that when the lane starts to move, this is a sign that your lane is going to move in the future. I think that rings true, right? So you update to think that life is going to be good for you. But if that lane keeps moving, then your update turns the other way. You think that this is actually a structural change in which I'm not going to participate. And what was first a healthy, salubrious increase in my aspirations may then turn into a sense of frustration. Okay, so it's this honeymoon period that Hirschman emphasizes. So in this, so in this background, if you think about the responses that we might have to uneven growth, again, Mark talked about a couple of them, right? So most important response to uneven growth is occupational choice, okay, or acquisition of human capital, changes in the way in the way we are or our children are over time, right? Except for the fact that occupational choice, by its very nature, is slow. You have to learn something, you have to train yourself, you have to move into a new sector. It's often intergenerational, okay, that we are seeing occupational choice in action in some of Mark's studies where we are looking at children enrolled in school, so it's intergenerational. And finally, it's imprecise, right? By the time you get to this new occupational setup, the world may have moved on, scurried off into another direction, right? Which will then have to be chased. So we're always chasing moving targets, right? And this has to be, overlaid on this is something else, which is what I'm calling here the great acceleration. Okay, so you can guess what these numbers are, right? So okay, I won't let you guess for a long time, but here is the United Kingdom. 1780 is the starting date, right? 58 is the number of years it took for the UK economy to double, okay, per capita double. Then the United States, 1839, 47 years. Japan, 1885, 34 years. Brazil, 1961, 18 years. Korea, 1966, 11 years. And China from 1980 onwards, every 7 to 9 years. Okay? So all of this stuff is not just happening on a treadmill, it's happening on a treadmill that's gradually increasing in its incline, right? So all of this is, so it is not hard to imagine why feelings of aspirations and positive investment in many situations may turn into negative ones of frustration and conflict. Okay, so that's really the background. That's the way I think about the connection between development and conflict. So that's fine. So that's a start. Okay, but then that leads to the all-important question of salience. Okay, so uneven growth, it's likely that uneven growth is going to lead to conflict along some lines. But along what lines? What is it that we expect to see emerging in these countries? So here are some examples, maybe religion, maybe ethnicity, maybe geography, occupation, class, right? Well, we have a venerable individual who gave us an answer to that question, Marx, okay? And he says that, well, when you see a lot of inequality, you should expect all the conflictual, antagonistic action to come from along class lines. And in fact, we have many examples of that. So I put up an example on Maoist violence in rural India, where in the Maoist belt, there are tribal lands, which the Maoists are fighting presumably to protect, where a lot of the tribal lands contain mineral deposits, which the big industrialists are trying to seize, right? Now, this example is actually, I'm going to argue that it's an outlier rather than the rule. Okay, so I'm going to argue that the Marxist argument is problematic. And that's for one very important, actually there's two important reasons, but in this talk I'll only have the time to emphasize one of them. And it's this, that conflict typically occurs over directly contested resources. Okay? So here are examples: labor markets, agrarian land, real estate. Rohini has worked actually on the use of conflict to bring down real estate prices. Business, business rivalries and so forth. So I've given you some examples here and there. Now, the corollary of conflict over directly contested resources is this, that typically conflict will occur between economically similar rather than economically different groups. Okay? Now, Marx has taught us to believe that the conflict occurs between people, let's say, who own the means of production and people who don't, people in very different occupational niches. The argument that I'm making here is that conflict is likely to happen across people in very similar occupational niches. Okay? And that's simply because the sense of antagonism, the sense of competition is direct. It's not indirect like class conflict. Now, sometimes, here's a counterexample, okay? Sometimes these resources have two very different uses, as in the Maoist conflict, okay? So there's land on which you can cultivate, or you can forest that land, or you can extract bauxite from it, okay? So land appears in two completely different guises, and therefore can generate a class conflict, because the people who use bauxite as input are very different from the people who use land for cultivation. But that's and there are other examples, like the use of land in agriculture or industry. This is a slightly different example. I don't have time to get in. And that will give you class violence. But that's the exception rather than the rule, because most of the time, these resources don't have two faces, bauxite and cultivation. The resources have one face. I'm working in the textile sector, and I want to get my rival out of there. I run a business in brassware. I want to get my rival out of there. Okay? There's no two faces to it, and therefore it's similar people that's engaging in conflict. Now, when similar people engage in conflict, are they going to just randomly flail around and throw out any rival in their way? Well, that's one possibility that might happen, just anarchic chaos in conflict. But as you might imagine, it's inefficient. There's room there for an entrepreneur, a political entrepreneur, an economic entrepreneur, to come in and say, let's pick on a marker that already exists, and let's organize conflict along those lines. So if we are both workers working in the textile sector, if you're an immigrant and I'm a native, that's a pretty salient marker. If you're Muslim and I'm Hindu, that would be a very salient marker. So this is the way I think about why conflict or uneven development translates into conflict, but often not into class conflict, but conflict along horizontal lines rather than vertical lines. Okay? So this is why Horowitz, one of the big observers of this scene, has written this beautiful line which says, in much of Asia and Africa, it's only modest hyperbole to assert that the Marxian prophecy has had an ethnic fulfillment. Okay? Which is I think is quite an interesting point. So so what I'm taking here is what one might call the instrumentalist approach to conflict, namely that conflict is across groups that seem to hate each other, religious groups, ethnic groups of different kinds, but the underlying reason for that conflict is economic. Okay? And this is to be contrasted with another view, which is known as the primordialist view, is where that these groups are fighting simply because they hate each other. The former view, as an economist, is obviously more attractive to many of us in this room, and also it leads us to a research agenda where we try to link economics to the prevalence of such conflict outcomes. So very quickly, let me tell you about let me tell you about some work which shows how these ethnic divisions are in fact conflictual. And this is based on joint work with Joan Esteban. So, for example, in work that we've done with Joan and later on with Laura Mayoral, who's actually sitting there at the back of the room, there are groups which are engaged in conflict over some combination of a public prize or a private prize. And public prizes like political control or religious dominance or sheer hatred, public goods and so forth. And private prizes like oil, diamonds, and scarce land. And then we model a conflict equilibrium, and the main result of that paper is that the conflict over public goods is related to ethnic polarization. This is the theoretical result. I'm not saying that this is the empirical finding yet. And while conflict over private goods is going to get related to fractionalization. So the only equation I have in this entire presentation is conflict per capita is approximately connected to a convex combination of polarization and fractionalization, where the weights on the convex combination have to do with the degree of publicness of the prize. Now, what's interesting about that is that it disciplines the way you take something to the data. This tells you that if you want to actually look at whether ethnic divisions are conflictual, you should be weighting ethnic polarization by whatever estimate you have of the public prize at stake, while you weight ethnic fractionalization by whatever estimates you have of the private prize at stake. Now, you might imagine, and there's a lot of work that Laura and Joanne and I have done on this, there's a lot of stuff here which is heroic, which I should respond to more accurately in the question and answer session. But just to show you how this works, this is a regression run on the dependent variables. Here are different measures of conflict, one taken from PRIO and one taken from a continuous indicator of conflict due to banks. And what you can see, and this is a cross-country regression on 138 countries. What you see is that there's a very strong connection between polarization and fractionalization, okay, and the existence of conflict. But what's interesting is that when this number lambda, what's interesting is that when you weight this combination by indices of the public and the private price, then the direct effect of polarization and fractionalization completely disappear, and all of the action takes place through these two interaction terms. Okay? So it suggests not only that polarization and fractionalization are linked to conflict, but it suggests that there may indeed be an instrumental role to conflict, and moreover, that the instrumental role plays itself out along the lines that I'm suggesting, that polarization is linked to public goods conflict, while fractionalization is linked to private goods conflict. Okay. So what about economic inequality then? Okay. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay, very good. So what about economic inequality? So what I've done is now I've gone horizontally into this ethnic thing. Okay, so what about economic inequality? Well, amazingly enough, but not surprisingly to me after I've done some thinking about this, there appears to be really no connection between overall economic inequality and the existence of conflict. So Lichtbach has this survey from 1989. The reason I put it up is because he talks about 43 papers and says some of them are best forgotten. I like that. Okay? Some are best forgotten. And there you get the fairly typical finding, I'm quoting from the bottom, of a weak, barely significant relationship between inequality and political violence. Rarely is there a robust relationship between these two variables. Okay? Laura and I didn't believe it. So we ran our own regression to take a look. Okay? And it is astonishing but true, so this is actually done with country fixed effects. It's astonishing but true that along various measures of conflict, if you regress that on inequality, if anything, you get the opposite sign. Okay? It's just not there, the effect. So why am I saying it's not surprising? Well, it's not surprising because if you take the view that conflict is organized along ethnic lines rather than along class lines, then notice that you would have two obvious predictions, which I'll come to if I have a couple of more minutes to spare at the end, which is that the wealth of your rival group, whoever is your rival group, right, is going to be related to your gains from conflict. Whereas the wealth of your group, the own group, is going to be directly related to the costs of conflict, right? So the wealth of my rivals is like something that attracts me, wants me to wage conflict because I want to loot my rival. But my own wealth is an opportunity cost, right? So it's not surprising that there is actually no connection between intergroup inequality or economic inequality more broadly defined and conflict. Take, for example, a case where the rival group is poorer than you. When the wealth of the rival group goes up, the society is going to get more equal, and yet there could be more conflict. Okay? So I'm going to skip this, but there's actually a large literature which I've separated into two parts. The first literature that I put up on the slides here, sorry, the one over here on More to Grab, talks about how these are mainly ethnographic studies which relate grabbing incentives of your rival group to conflict. Okay? So, for example, competition in real estate, labor markets, competition in the textile sector, competition in bidis, which is a type of indigenous cigarettes, and brassware, wholesale silk trade, and so forth, right? And then there's another literature, one of the authors of which is sitting in this room, Lakshmi Iyer, okay, which talks about how the own group might have a greater or lower incentive to engage in conflict. Okay? And these two effects generally go in the opposite direction. Okay? Poverty for the own group tends to generate more conflict. Wealth for the rival group tends to generate more conflict. Okay? So I'm going to end by just giving you a little illustration of this idea using some recent work I've done with Anirban Mitra on Hindu-Muslim violence. So this is Hindu-Muslim violence in India from the partition era and later on. There's several ethnographic studies on this which suggest the two things. One is that there's a strong economic component to violence. And second, because Hindus are the majority group in India, that typically Hindus are the aggressor. Okay? I'm going to give you two very quick facts to back this up. This is just from the ethnographic studies. On the notion of the aggressor, okay, between 1985 to 1987, there were 526 Hindu-Muslim incidents in 10 states of India. Muslims were 12% of the population, but suffered 60% of the deaths, 45% of the injuries, and 73% of the property damage. And I'm going to give you one little quote on the idea, just to give you a sense on economics of Hindu-Muslim conflict. And this is from Asghar Ali, engineer, who died actually a month ago, one of the greatest observers on Hindu-Muslim violence in India. If religious zeal is coupled with economic prosperity, as has happened in Meerut, it has a multiplying effect on the Hindu psyche. The ferocity with which business establishments have been destroyed in Meerut bears testimony to this observation. Entire rows of shops belonging to Muslims were reduced to ashes. So this is an example of business rivalry between Hindus and Muslims. So the predictions of what we are talking about so far is that income growth among aggressors will tend to reduce conflict because it has an opportunity cost effect. And income group among victims will tend to increase conflict because it increases the prize, the loot that is available. And these two predictions together suggest that in particular, completing the circle, that economic progress can indeed be inflammatory rather than something that brings conflict down. Okay? So I just want to end by showing you these two diagrams. These diagrams come from 55 different regions in India. And each line, there are many lines here, you can't see the hairlines here, which each line joins one region on 3 different dates. Okay? In the late 70s, in the early 80s, and in the late 80s. Okay? And on the x-axis, what it plots is Muslim expenditure per capita in those regions. Okay? And on the y-axis, what it plots is casualties in the subsequent 5-year period. What I've removed, the only thing that has been removed in this diagram are region fixed effects and overall time effects. There are no other controls. This is the raw data except for these two sets of fixed effects which have been removed, right? And what you see is, I think, a pretty strong positive relationship between baseline Muslim expenditure and positive connection between that and subsequent conflict. When you look at the Hindu expenditure among groups, it's exactly the opposite. Okay? When Hindu expenditures go up, there is a reduction in conflict. And what Anirban and I do is actually take this to the data, and as you might imagine, given the nature of referees today in the economics profession, we hit it with several different robustness checks, okay? Including an instrumental variables exercise. But I think this diagram brings out the basic idea clearly enough. Okay? I was going to tell you about that, but I'm going to pass. How much time? Am I out?
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Yeah. Okay. Sure? Okay. Yeah. So then I want to say one more thing about the salience of ethnicity, which I think is important. Remember one thing I told you about the salience of ethnicity, which was direct contestation of resources leads to ethnic salience. That was one point. There's a second argument for ethnic salience, which is that conflict requires 2 inputs. It requires people and it requires money, okay? And when you have class conflict, one of the paradoxes of class conflict is that the people who are rich have the money but don't have the bodies, okay, because the opportunity cost is too high, whereas people who are poor have the bodies but don't have the money, okay? And it's when conflict is horizontal across different ethnic groups that you find within each group a substantial amount of inequality can allow you to generate a perverse synergy, right, between money and bodies. And I want to just end by telling you one line from a paper by Huber and Mayoral, Laura again, which I think is a very interesting paper. This you can't see, but Laura is to blame. I just copied the table from her diagram. But what it has here is that it gives you a number of different specifications, runs different regressions, but what it has right on the top is the Gini coefficient. Okay? Then what it has on the third line, BGI, is between group inequality. Okay? And what it has on the fifth line is within group inequality, okay, where groups are defined by ethnicities. Now you see with the Gini, there's no effect. Okay? If you look at between group inequality, no effect. But the one effect that stands out in all these specifications, and it's the one effect I really feel that is robust, which is that within group inequality is conflictual. And you see that across all the specifications in her work with humor. Okay? Higher within group inequality, more conflict. Okay, summarize. So economic development is fundamentally uneven. It has large effects on aspirations. Occupational choice is a slow process. So conflict is predicted, at least by Dr. Doom in this particular talk, right, under uneven development. The notion of us and them is profoundly contextual. The Marxian view sometimes makes sense, but not always. Direct contestability creates antagonism across similar groups, and non-class conflict, including ethnic conflict, may indeed be focal. And a research agenda in development economics cannot ignore this question of salience.